Hang on, I think I got an egg hatching. What is up, guys? So today we're actually taking our first look at regionals, trying to figure out what the most, I guess you could say, what the most meta team is that you should really be focusing on. This is going to be a kind of a two-part video. Today is going to be just the super meta, like top meta picks. Tomorrow I'm going to go over a little bit of our anti-meta picks and try to kind of figure out some awkward, less looked at options, I guess you could say, that can still do pretty well. So disclaimer for all of the information in this video, all the simulations come from pvpokey.com. All of the top 23 meta picks are also coming from pvpokey.com. And I do have a spreadsheet, which I'll link in the description, that I've compiled all 23 top meta picks in all three even shield situations, so 0 versus 0, 1 versus 1, and 2 versus 2, compiled against every compatible Pokemon inside of regionals, and try to give like how they win in those situations. It's almost like a battle matrix, if you will. Being that we have 23 Pokemon, I tried to narrow them down into specific groups and try to figure out like which Pokemon fits in which group, but it's extremely difficult because some of the Pokemon that are in the top 23 are just really hard counters to other Pokemon, while some of them are just tanks and just generalists that do really freaking well. But let's see how far I got down the rabbit hole before I started pulling my hair out. So we're actually going to be starting over here today with a best in class typing. So when I was looking through all of these Pokemon, I started to realize that a lot of these Pokemon are just best in class for some particular reason. They just have such a huge mainstay in the meta because of just how good they are as a generalist. So Medicham, and I'm not kidding, in all of the top 23 matchups, Medicham actually only averages 5.7 losses out of 23 Pokemon. That's big. That's across all shield situations, everything. Only 5 losses out of these top 23. So Medicham is super powerful for a couple of reasons. One, he has an amazing set of bulk. He can be maxed out in the Great League. He has counter, power-up punch, and just a couple of other really great moves, Ice Punch being the main one that we're going to be using for this video. And he's just flat out crazy good. If you don't have a Medicham, I definitely do think that it's going to set you a couple of paces back from others. Medicham's going to be really, really good. If you don't have one, I think it is going to set you a couple of paces behind, but not too bad. Next, we actually have a Azumarill. So Azumarill is a huge tank, has so much bulk, has access to water moves, has access to fairy moves, has access to ice moves, has access to a lot of different things that just really do make it a mainstay in a lot of teams. The fact that it has a ice move to help cover its grass weakness is really, really good. The fact that it's super tanky means that it can actually take a super effective shot here and there and still come out alive. Like, Azumarill is another one that I feel like a lot of people are gonna have. And if you don't have one, I don't think that it's quite as necessary as a Medicham, but it's still one of those Pokemon, like, man, if you don't have an Azumarill, it's also going to start to really put you behind as well. I think those two are like just the core of any regional team. Azumarill and Medicham are like at the worst. You should have those two. Then we have some other best in classes here. So Lantern, an amazingly bulky Pokemon with a great typing. Skarmory, I mean, we've seen Skarmory just outperform tons of different Pokemon. It has an amazing typing that sets up only 2 weaknesses, being fire and electric. Has access to some great flying type moves, and it's a really good counter to this guy up here. Steelix, huge bulk, best defense if I'm not mistaken. He has like the highest defense out of the league. Well, Shuckle's technically in this league, isn't he? He's a rock type. But anyways, so Steelix is just flat out amazing. He's got great moves that set him up to be really good against the dragons, really good up against the electric types. He's got an amazing typing that sets him up to have tons of resistances. Steelix is great. Tropius, a huge Razor Leaf user. We saw him back in the Tempest Cup, how powerful that Razor Leaf actually is. With Stab, that Razor Leaf is just doing insane amount of damage. It also has access to Stomp, which is a great neutral move. It has access to flying type moves, which make it a really big threat. It has good resistances towards the fighting typings. It's just an all-around great pick. Bastiodon really has a ton of great moves working for him. He has rock type moves, is really great up against the flyers. He has access to fire type, which is actually really good up against the grass types and the ice types that are going to be running around in the meta. Altaria is amazing. We've seen that Altaria just has tons of bulk, has great moves, has access to a ton of really interesting stuff that really makes it a mainstay in most teams. I think Altaria is like so after Medicham and Azumarill, I'm really thinking like Altaria is one of those that like it feels like it just needs to be on my team. It doesn't necessarily need to be, but man, it just really feels like, oh, am I really going to go into this Great League match without a freaking Altaria? And then down here at the bottom, we do have the Mud Boys. So the Mud Boys do make a return in the Regionals Cup here. Things like Whiscash, Quagsire, Swampert makes an appearance, Marshtomp. All the Mud Boys really do really well. And there's one that I don't know how to really like assess this, because Gastrodon technically is out there. Like, he was released for what, like a couple of hours, and just so happens that, oh oops, Niantic flipped that switch and turned it back off. He does have access to Hidden Power, which does kind of skew his actual usability, especially in my spreadsheet. But he does actually have Mud Shot, Body Slam, Earthquake, Water Pulse. Yeah, I'm pretty sure those are it. And then he has Hidden Power as his other fast move. So he has access to like some crazy moves. Mud Shot and Body Slam. Can you imagine powering up just as fast as Celio, but with ground type damage, and then hitting for that neutral Body Slam? Like, ooh, that's pretty freaking great. According to my spreadsheet, he does rank extremely high in the average number of losses that he has. So he only ends up losing an average of 6 losses amongst all shield situations, all 3 even shield situations, if you will. He does basically blow everyone else out of the water except for Medicham, but I do think that whenever I ran all these simulations, I did not go through and try to like cherry pick Gastrodon to have that exact moveset. So remember, if you're going into this spreadsheet to look at these Pokemon, some of them will be a little skewed, especially if they have Hidden Power, because PvPoke is going to choose Hidden Power, whichever one is super effective, up against the enemy Pokemon that is basically going to be worth it. Like up against Tropius, Gastrodon has all 3 shield situations winning up against Tropius when it has no sense in doing so, but it's because I guarantee it chose the Ice type Hidden Power up against Tropius, being that he would be quad weak to that, instead of using that Mud Shot as its fast move, because obviously Mud Shot wouldn't do nearly as good up against Tropius as Hidden Power Ice. Just something to keep in mind. Mud Boys are huge. I really do think that Mud Boys have a very interesting typing that make them quite good in a lot of scenarios. Plus, a lot of them have Mud Shot and then Mud Bomb, which is just amazing. It's really fast, it's really quick, and it can really break some shields in a lot of scenarios. So I definitely think that Mud Boys deserve a mention here in the best in class. Then we also have some anti-best in class picks here. So things like Melmetal do really good up against the flyers. Skarmory has a big problem with Melmetal. Tropius, not too shabby. I mean, he does decent up against Tropius, but it's not really like his main shtick. He does good up against Altaria. He does good up against quite a few Pokemon that just are really big mainstays, and that is really crazy because I wouldn't have thought when Melmetal first released that he would actually be viable in this many scenarios. Then we have Haunter, or kind of the ghost types in general. The ghost types have a really good place because they resist so much of that fighting damage that they can be a really good hard counter to Medicham, especially with a certain set of moves. Like ghost type moves are really going to start hurting Medicham in a lot of scenarios because it does carry that psychic typing, and you can kind of just start to break through that Medicham wall that a lot of teams are going to be able to have. So Venusaur ends up being another anti-best in class simply because just his sheer amount of bulk. He does have quite a bit of bulk. The problem is that he does kind of need Frenzy Plant to be as viable, but he's really, really good up against things like the Mud Boys. He does really good up against the Azumarill. He actually can end up beating Bastiodon in a more than one shield scenario. So in the 1v1 and the 2v2, he definitely can end up pulling that out. And then in the Lantern matchup, he actually does really good. In the Magneton matchup, he actually has favorable matchups in the 1v1 and the 2v2. In the Steelix matchup, he actually wins in the 0v0 and the 2v2, but he loses in that 1v1. And then Tropius as well ends up beating Tropius, ends up beating Umbreon, and can end up beating the Mud Boys, of course, which we've already talked about. So Venusaur is definitely pretty powerful. He does kind of have some problems whenever it comes to like flying type moves and stuff of the sort, but he definitely does have a place. And then we have this like neutral category. These are some other things that have kind of been thrown in here that just don't really like fit a specific spot, but they do have a pretty big place because either they're extremely tanky and they can output tons of neutral damage, or they have just like a decent matchup up against one of the best in classes, and then they actually have just like crazy good matchups against many other things. So I do have a Alolan Muck and Skuntank written up there, but some other ones of these are like Sableye, Umbreon actually. I would say Frostlass kind of goes into this category. Forretress goes into this category. Charizard, Bronzong, things of the nature that don't necessarily like have a specific target here, but they do really well up against a wide set of Pokemon. So after I got done doing this part, I was kind of like, oh, it's like, how am I going to group all of these? Well, here you go. So this is basically the giant wheel of the freaking regional. Basically, we have our two main Pokemon, Medicham and Azumarill. So from top to bottom, all the way around, let's just start with Medicham and we'll talk kind of how he fits into this wheel. So Medicham is at the top of the wheel here. He's a powerhouse, a must-have. Just looking at my spreadsheet, let's actually look at all of the matchups that he actually ends up winning out of these top 23. So with Medicham's matchups and the Altaria matchup, it is kind of dependent on how well the Altaria can read the shields. So if it doesn't shield that first power-up punch, then it ends up having a pretty easy time shielding the ice punch that usually is to follow. So you can actually win in the 1v1 and 2v2 scenarios as long as you can properly shield bait those power-up punches and the ice punches, kind of distinguish between the two. Medicham actually ends up losing to Azumarill in all shield scenarios. Bastiodon is the opposite, where we just flat out beat Bastiodon in all scenarios. Bronzong, which Bronzong may actually have had Feint Attack in the simulations now that I think about it, but he definitely does end up losing in the 1v1 and 2v2 while winning in the actual 0 versus 0. Charizard is the same. Charizard actually ends up winning in the 0 versus 0, but ends up losing the 1v1 and 2v2. Forretress loses all three. Frostlass actually beats the 0 versus 0, but ends up losing the 1v1 and 2v2. Haunter actually ends up winning all three scenarios. Lantern actually ends up losing all three. Magneton loses all three. Alolan Marowak actually ends up winning the 0 versus 0 and the 1v1, but loses the 2v2. I'm sure that is kind of dependent on your shielding there. Medicham up against itself should be a tie. Melmetal actually loses all three. Alolan Muck loses all three. Quagsire loses all three. Sableye wins all three. Skarmory actually wins the 0 versus 0 and the 1v1, but not the 2v2. Skuntank actually loses all three. Steelix loses all three. Tropius loses all three. Umbreon loses all three. Venusaur loses 0 versus 0 and 1v1, can tie in the 2v2, and Whiscash actually loses all three. So you can kind of see just how blatantly powerful freaking Medicham is. In the 0 versus 0 shield situations, he only loses 9 out of 23, 5 in the 1v1, and 3 in the 2v2. So you can see as he gets more shields, he just quickly gets better and better every single time. So he's such a good powerhouse that you should really, really think I gotta get a hold of one. Like, even if it's a lucky one so that you can save the dust, whatever it can cost you, I think Medicham is just one of those Pokemon that really... So next we actually have the steel types here. So the steel types have many resistances, and they have a great anchor position. So when I'm talking about our steel types, I'm talking about like Bronzong, Magneton, Melmetal, Steelix, Skarmory, things of the nature. So they all end up having really good resistances that ends up making them have a ton of neutral damage that either comes at them or ends up just being completely resisted all on its own. The problem with the steel types though is that that's kind of what Medicham is there for. He's there to just completely wreck that steel typing. So our steel types actually usually end up doing decent up against Azumarill. It's not like a clear-cut win. Some of them are pretty bad, some of them are decent. It's just kind of a hit and miss, if you will, with Azumarill. So things like Melmetal does really good up against Azumarill. Skarmory has an awkward position where Skarmory can tie in some scenarios, but it doesn't really like do like super good. Magneton actually does really well here. And Bronzong actually has some stay, actually tying in the 0 versus 0 and then winning the 1v1 and the 2v2 just slightly though. Those are very close matchups. So Bronzong actually can help a little bit. But like in general, the steels do okay up against Azumarill, but there's not a lot that actually does do good up against Azumarill. It was really hard to find a spot that really made sense going up against Azumarill here. The steel types that you want to actually stay away from whenever you're talking about Azumarill are like Bastiodon and Steelix. Those both have really hard times going up against it because it actually has access to that bubble. And even in the awkward situation where maybe that Azumarill is running Rock Smash, it would still actually end up hurting both of those. So just keep that in mind, that Azumarill is really hard to counter, but basically you're trying to exploit any kind of weakness that it has. Unfortunately, it doesn't have too many of those. Only having a weakness to electric, grass, and poison ends up having a really good set of tools for Azumarill to use, but you kind of have to figure out a way to get around that, which is kind of interesting for these guys here, Skuntank, Alolan Muk. Plus, with the Venusaur, the Tropius, the Lantern, the Melmetal, like you kind of get like certain Pokemon that do good up against it, but in general, it's really hard to counter. Which, that actually kind of moves us into the Azumarill slot. So Azumarill is a powerhouse here again with much tank. So you kind of like have to play around the Azumarill in a lot of scenarios because with its unique water and fairy typing, Bug, Dark, Dragon, Fighting, Fire, Ice, and Water are all resisted with that. Like we said before, only being weak to Electric, Grass, and Poison has pretty big implications because there's not too many poison out there. Now, Haunter also does kind of have a chance here because it can actually use that Sludge Bomb, Sludge Wave, Sludge Bomb, and it can actually exploit some of that weakness from Azumarill being the poison type. But it's a lot harder to break down that Azumarill wall than a lot of people are initially expecting. It's extremely tanky, like super tanky. I hate how tanky it is, although I love it on the other hand. So definitely think about like your poisons, your grasses, and your electrics that really do go good into this Azumarill matchup because you're gonna need those. Next, moving on to our rock down here. So rock is not like the greatest descriptor for this section, but it's just kind of those things that can actually help target a lot of the neutral matchups, which we'll get here in a second. So the rock side is great for flyers, and what I'm trying to get at there are things that end up having rock type moves that can kind of just take out some of the more awkward matchups. Things like Bastiodon, Melmetal, Quagsire, Sableye, all these Pokemon having access to a rock type move can really have a decent effect in a lot of scenarios, and it's because these rock type moves end up having really good effects on a lot of flying types that we're going to see, and I think that it helps a lot in certain scenarios to have that extra out. Now the problem with this section is that it's extremely weak to this Azumarill matchup, and it also can be pretty weak to this Medicham. So while it's not like the best thing to call this section, I really don't know what else to call it. It's kind of like that Bastiodon, Melmetal, Quagsire, Sableye section. Next we're moving on to our neutral here. So neutral has just a weird name in itself again here, but neutral damage for the ghost is basically what we're going for, and it's actually great for the off meta picks. So what I'm talking about neutral there, Sableye falls into this category again, Umbreon falls in here, Lantern falls in here, Haunter, Frostlass, Fortress, Charizard, things of the nature fall in here because while they do have some super effectiveness inside of this wheel, mostly their damage is going to be neutral, and a lot of that neutral damage is really good up against the ghost because ghost types end up being only weak to ghost themselves and dark types. They're not going to have a ton of super effective damage coming at them, so the neutral is kind of what I was thinking is probably best suited up against them, because bringing a ghost into a ghost type match is just kind of kamikaze. While I love playing like that, I don't think it's very safe. I just have a psychotic obsession. So the neutral matchup here is really just what's going for the ghost. Something that can actually take out the ghost. Basically, as long as you're using something that isn't poison or bug up against those, then you should be pretty good. And then we have this lonely ghost type as our last one here. So it actually ends up resisting the fighters hardcore here, and it's good to have up against a confusion user, because I do feel like a lot of people are like moving towards this, let's have a really good confusion user. Out of the top 23 Pokemon that I have been using today, Bronzong is a really good one. And Bronzong has a really interesting place because he's going to be able to resist a ton of that psychic damage, which makes a lot of sense. He would be really good up against a lot of the other psychic types, but he does have a problem with the ghost type moves here. So it could be really good to have for a confusion user, but mainly what you're wanting it for is to hardcore resist that fighting type. What team should you really like focus on for as if you're taking a super meta team? I definitely think that this is a good start for you. I don't think that this is the end all be all of the meta. I mean, I've put in like 3 hours worth of research into this, so it's not like super fleshed out. It's not the end all be all, and I don't think that a ton of people are going to agree with it, but this is just kind of what I have. So I definitely think that if you're interested in building a super meta team, look into the spreadsheet that I'll have down in the description. You can see all of the shielding scenarios and how which Pokemon do what. So basically, you can try to figure out which Pokemon do really well. The spreadsheet will play a huge role in tomorrow's video, because what we'll be doing is basically sorting by which Pokemon have the least amount of losses and trying to figure out which ones of those are most likely going to get you really far in the regionals meta. So that is actually it for today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out. This is probably an extremely long video, but I really am looking forward to regionals. It's going to be really fun. The atmosphere is what I'm most excited about, because I used to play in a lot of TCGs, and going to regionals was always fun. And even though my friends never played with me, I always played by myself. Either way, thank you guys so much for watching. Always remember that if you like to like videos, make sure you do that. If you don't, you can be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in those comments below. As far as deep dives go on the regional meta, I just plan on doing these 2 videos. I don't want to like start doing deep dives on the regional meta, only because it's just, there's no way I'm gonna be able to get to all of them, and that bothers me. If you guys are seriously interested, I may want to do like one on Azumarill and Medicham, but that's only if you guys are like super interested in that. Otherwise, after tomorrow, I'm just going to continue on with Nightmare Cup. So, yeah. Anyways, catch you guys later.